The void between stars is silent, but silence in the galaxy is never peace. It is the pause before something vast stirs. For 60 million years beneath the dust of dead worlds and the crust of forgotten moons they have slept, unmoving, unbreathing, waiting for the cold mathematics of eternity to align in their favor. The Necrons, countless tomb worlds sealed in black metal, their sarcophagi humming with energies older than humanity's first spark of fire. Now imagine not a gradual awakening of one dynasty here, one tomb complex there, but all of them. Every sepulchre, every stasis crypt, every silent fortress shuddering open in unison. A single exhalation of ancient power unleashed upon the galaxy in one terrible instant. What would remain when the stars themselves are treated as clay by a civilization that has already slain gods? What hope could any species cling to when the silence breaks everywhere at once? And if this vision grips you, if this deep dive into the dread possibilities of the Warhammer 40,000 universe speaks to your imagination, then linger with us. Subscribe, share, and carry these stories further into the warp stream of the algorithm so that more can glimpse the same terrible wonder. Your support shapes the survival of this chronicle, just as surely as a guardsman's last bolt decides the momentary fate of the battlefield. Chapter 1. The Shuddering Tombs. The desert was not empty, though it had always seemed so. To the survey teams that had mapped its shifting dunes, it was merely an inconvenience of heat and silence, a barren stretch catalogued and dismissed. Yet beneath those endless ridges of sand lay something immeasurably older than the Imperium itself, older than the first sparks of fire on Terra. Beneath the dust, a tomb world dreamed. Its dreaming was measured not in years or centuries, but in aeons, and that sleep was never meant to be eternal. On the day it stirred, the air itself became strange. At first, there was only the trembling, a faint vibration that the guardsmen stationed at Outpost Solus 47 mistook for the whine of distant engines. But the sound was not above them. It was below. The earth began to hum with a resonance that traveled up through boots, rattling teeth in skulls, causing metal canteens to sing against stone. It was not a quake, not entirely. There was no violence in the motion, only inevitability, like a lock turning in a door that had been sealed before humanity had a name for itself. Private Chiron remembered the moment most vividly as the taste. The air carried a copper tang sharp on the tongue, as though the atmosphere itself had grown metallic. The Vox grill at his throat crackled with static even when he turned it off, and every machine spirit in the hab blocks flickered with nervous unrest. Data slates went dark, cogitators stalled mid-equation, and the Auspex towers froze in useless silence. Tech adepts hissed Binharic litanies, striking their machines with ritual taps, but nothing banished the interference. Something older than their sacred codes had entered the field. Then came the sound of stone splitting. The ground outside the outpost convulsed, not upward but downward, as though the planet were breathing in. Sand poured into widening fissures that yawned like mouths, swallowing entire barricades and transport vehicles without resistance. Where once the desert had lain flat and featureless, now vast geometric lines were etched into its surface, glowing faintly with baleful green fire. Those patterns were not random. They were glyphs, sigils written in a language humanity had forgotten, but which the galaxy itself remembered with dread. Chiron clutched his laser gun tighter, though what good it would do against the sight unfolding before him he could not have said. The sergeant barked orders that felt like whispers drowned beneath the rising chorus of machinery below the crust. Something was waking, and the desert was only its mask. Then the first monolith rose. It did not erupt with force nor shatter the land in a violent birth. It ascended with grace as though it had always belonged there, as though gravity itself bent in reverence. Blackstone, seamless and vast, pushed through the sands like a blade through flesh. Its surface was polished mirror dark, yet run through with veins of pulsing green light that throbbed in rhythm with the trembling ground. It climbed until it dwarfed the outpost walls, until the shadow it cast consumed the barracks and Vox spires, until men and women felt themselves made insignificant by its very existence. And as the monolith rose, others answered. Across the horizon, in every direction, towers of necrodermis broke the surface. The desert was not land at all, but a lid, a seal, sarcophagus lid thrown open by unseen hands. The air turned colder with each structure's emergence, not by weather but by something deeper, a draining of vitality itself. Frost formed on lasgun barrels, Vox displays blurred with impossible glyphs, and every heartbeat in every chest faltered for a moment, as though their flesh had been reminded it was mortal. In the command chamber, the senior Vox officer screamed into his console, trying to raise orbit. No signal escaped. The heavens were as silent as the sands below. The Adeptus Mechanicus adepts present could not explain it. Null field, one rasped, his voice broken with Binharic static. Null beyond comprehension. They had no word for it, but the feeling spread through the garrison. They had been erased, cut off. Whatever was rising did not wish to be observed until it chose to be. Then the doors began to open. Massive panels of necrodermis slid aside with a sound like 1,000 blades unsheathing, and from within emerged the first of the Necron warriors. They stepped with precision, their movements unnervingly measured, not the lurch of flesh or the organic instinct of predators. They were symmetrical in their inevitability, every stride echoing with the certainty of conquest. Green light bled from their eye sockets, unwavering and merciless. Gauss flares were gripped in skeletal hands that glimmered as though carved from midnight itself. The guardsmen fired. Last bolts cracked across the open plain, red streaks vanishing against the darkness of the Necron ranks. A few struck true, but no wound was left. No dent, no burn, no hesitation. The Necrons walked through it as though the fire were meaningless, their inexorable approach eroding the courage of mortals faster than the beams burned air. And when they returned fire, the desert screamed. A single sweep of green lightning tore through a squad, unmaking flesh, armor, and stone in a seamless unraveling. There was no explosion, no scatter of shrapnel, only dissolution, the reduction of life into ash that drifted away on a wind that had not existed before. The sergeant's orders broke into screams, and men scattered across the sands. Charon ran without memory of the decision, his feet carrying him not toward cover but simply away. Yet everywhere he turned, another structure was rising, another cohort emerging, another glyph blazing to life. The tomb was not opening. The world was. And as the sky dimmed with an unnatural shadow, as though the sun itself had been cowed, Charon realized something deeper than fear. This was not invasion. This was reclamation. Humanity had never owned this soil. They had been squatters in a necropolis that had simply been patient enough to wait for the moment it chose to awaken. The first Vox signal finally pierced the interference then, but it was not from orbit. It was from below, a voice metallic and cold, whispering in no tongue any human could understand, yet carrying with it the weight of inevitability. It was not meant to be understood. It was meant to remind the galaxy that its silence had only ever been slumber, and the slumber was over. The panic of the garrison was not the disorder of men who had lost their nerve, but of prey realizing it had never been predator. Commissar Darren stood upon the command balcony, bolt pistol raised high, his voice cutting through the chaos with the iron certainty of doctrine. He bellowed litanies of the Emperor's dominion, promising his light would scour these Xenos abominations. For a moment his defiance steadied the troops. They rallied, lasguns raised, heavy bolters braced upon the ramparts. Vox amplifiers carried his words across the dunes, daring the silence to answer. The silence did answer. It answered with the shriek of gauss fire. Lances of viridian energy reducing emplacements and men alike to skeletal dust. A heavy bolter turret vanished in a hiss of light, its crew screaming only until their bodies were no longer bodies at all. The commissar fired, his bolt pistol cracking through the haze, and he did strike one Necron warrior square in the chest. The shell detonated, shredding blackened metal into fragments that collapsed into the sand. A cheer rose from the guardsmen, then faltered. Before their eyes the fragments convulsed, glimmering with emerald threads that wove themselves together, reassembling bone and plate, reconstructing what had seemed destroyed. Within breaths the warrior stood again, its eye lights burning even brighter as if mockery itself was its reward. Darren did not falter. He roared defiance until the gauss lightning took him, unraveling flesh, bone, and pistol into the same nothingness. His final oath to the Emperor was cut short not by silence but by absence. The morale he had conjured collapsed with him. The soldiers broke, yet still the Necrons advanced. They did not hurry, did not charge. They walked as though they had no need to waste energy on haste. Time belonged to them. Every second spent in retreat by the humans was one more stone in their inevitability. The warriors' feet pressed into the sand with ritual precision, each step a hammer beat in a march older than stars. Behind them larger constructs stirred, their silhouettes jagged against the dimming sky. Immortals heavier and broader, their weapons hissing with an anticipation that was not hunger, but simple purpose. In the barracks, Tech Adept Solari knelt before a failing cogitator bank, his mechadendrites twitching in agitation. He whispered canticles of appeasement, offering binary prayers into circuits that refused to respond. His organic eye streamed tears while the bionic one flickered with error runes. "It is not machine," he muttered, voice breaking. "It is not spirit. It is the absence of both." The adept's words spread like contagion, the garrison's last faith in technology curdling into dread. Even the Emperor's light seemed thin here, the chapel lumen fires sputtering without wind. Meanwhile, Chiron found himself pressed against the outer wall, his breath ragged, sand caking his lips. He could no longer hear the orders of any officer, only the low resonant vibration from beneath the surface. It grew stronger with every moment, not like machinery alone, but like a heart vast enough that the planet itself might have been its vessel. He thought of Terra, of the shrine worlds he had never seen, and the fleeting memory burned like a candle in a storm. For what was a candle against an entire sun that had chosen to rise after 60 million years? Then the first night scythe descended. It carved through the clouds like a blade of obsidian, its crescent form glowing with sickly fire. The air around it screamed as it bent gravity to its will, and with it came the drone of engines not fueled by promethium, but by equations so alien they mocked comprehension. It did not come alone. One after another, the sky filled with their shapes, descending not as an army dispatched from orbit, but as vultures descending to reclaim a feast that had always belonged to them. The outpost's remaining Hydra flak cannons fired, their barrages filling the heavens with tracers. Some struck true, detonating against the alien hulls, but every wreck fell without satisfaction. The downed ships did not explode. They folded, collapsing into collapsing shards of light as though their destruction was only a temporary inconvenience. And in moments the shapes reformed whole again, gliding downward with the same patience as their kin. Within the command chamber, the last Vox burst carried a desperate plea to Segmentum Command, words choked with static and terror. "This is Solus 47. We are undone. Emperor, preserve us. The dead walk and we, then nothing." The transmission did not cut out. It was consumed as if rewritten into silence by a hand that could erase sound itself. The last sight Chiron saw before throwing himself into the dunes was a figure larger than the rest, stepping through the newly formed gate within the rising monolith. Its form was regal, towering, adorned with crown-like glyphs that shimmered in the pale light. Unlike the rank-and-file warriors, this one radiated authority so ancient it transcended the word. Around it, the other Necrons slowed, aligning themselves as though the presence itself dictated the rhythm of reality. The Overlord had awakened, and the desert, once silent, now spoke with its true voice. The Overlord's emergence changed the rhythm of the battlefield. Where before the Necron warriors advanced in measured silence, now their precision found focus. Their movements harmonized to the presence of their master. Its crown of glyphs pulsed with a steady cadence, each flare echoed by the ranks in formation, until the entire legion moved as one organism. There was no signal, no command barked aloud, but every unit adjusted as though thought itself had become collective. Chiron stumbled down the dunes, Blaze gun clutched uselessly against his chest, his boots slipping in the shifting sands. He dared a glance back toward the outpost. It was no longer an outpost at all. The walls, the spires, the banners of the Imperial Aquila, all were swallowed beneath rising monoliths and the emerald latticework of geometric pathways. Where once had stood human fortifications, now stretched a necropolis awakening, its alien geometry rewriting the desert into something altogether different. A tide of skeletal warriors advanced outward, the ground behind them sealing itself into smooth black stone, as though the planet's own skin was being reforged in their image. The sound of retreat was chaos. Guardsmen tumbled through the dunes, some screaming oaths to the Emperor, others breaking into wordless sobs. Vox units hissed static into the wind, their frequencies smothered by the same interference that drowned all hope of reinforcement. Overhead night scythes swept low, beams of viridian fire slicing through lines of fleeing troops with surgical cruelty. Men vanished mid-sprint, their bodies dissolving into ash that barely had time to scatter before the next beam claimed another. There were no survivors, only delays in eradication. Chiron fell beside another guardsman, a boy younger than himself whose face was smeared with dust and blood. His eyes were wide, reflecting the impossible light rising behind them. "What are they?" the boy gasped. Chiron opened his mouth, but no word came, for what could be said. To name them was to invite despair, and yet silence offered no comfort. In the end, Chiron spoke the only word that fit, though it was a word half-whispered, half-prayed: Necrons. The boy shook his head as if denying a curse. His denial lasted only moments before a night scythe's beam cut him from existence, leaving Chiron choking on sand that now carried the ash of his comrade. Far above, the sky grew darker still, though the sun remained unclouded. It was not nightfall, but something heavier, an eclipse wrought by forces that did not obey the mechanics of celestial bodies. The stars themselves seemed smothered, veiled by a growing shroud of unlight. It was then that the first cryptek appeared, drifting from the heart of the newly opened tomb complex, its silhouette slender and elongated, crowned by mechanical arrays that pulsed with sinister calculation. Where the warriors embodied inevitability, the cryptek radiated intent. Its staff crackled with strands of viridian lightning, weaving arcs across the battlefield that tore through fleeing soldiers as though plucking threads from a tapestry. Each death was efficient, clinical. The cryptek moved not as a warrior but as a craftsman correcting flaws in a design. Where pockets of human resistance remained, it directed beams of energy to cut trenches into the dunes, herding survivors into traps where warriors closed in from every side. Chiron and a handful of others fell into one such trench, the sand collapsing around them like a wound deliberately carved. They huddled there, breaths shallow as the air above hissed with gauze fire. One soldier, maddened with desperation, rose from cover, firing his laser gun until the pack burned out. His red bolts vanished uselessly against the armor of the advancing Necrons. A single return shot ended him, unmaking his body so swiftly the echo of his scream outlasted the flesh that made it. Chiron pressed himself lower, tasting grit between his teeth, feeling the trench itself tremble with each passing stride of the Necron advance. The others looked to him as though he could offer something more than silence. He had nothing. Then came the shadow that silenced even their shallow breaths. A Canoptech wraith slithered into view, its form half solid, half phasing, its body a coil of segmented plates glimmering with cold energy. Its movements were serpentine, impossibly smooth, each shift of its elongated frame accompanied by the faint hum of dimensional distortion. Its face was a skull stretched too long, its eye light scanning the trench with hungerless scrutiny. It did not leap. It simply slid forward, gliding down into the trench as though gravity itself bent to accommodate its will. The survivors opened fire in panic, bolts of lass energy scattering harmlessly across its shimmering carapace. The wraith ignored them. Its phase field flickered, half of its body vanishing into another dimension, the other half gliding closer. Then it struck. One guardsman was lifted into the air, impaled upon the creature's tendrils, his body spasming until it was reduced to twitching ruin. Another tried to flee, only to be dragged beneath the sands, his screams muffled into silence. Chiron froze, his laser gun trembling in his hands. He did not fire. He knew it would do nothing. Instead, he pressed his back against the trench wall, his heart pounding, his mind a blur of prayers he could not remember finishing. The wraith's gaze lingered on him for one eternal moment, its green eyelights boring into his skull. Then inexplicably it moved on, phasing back through the wall, leaving him alive but marked. When he finally dared to raise his head, he saw the dunes collapsing into a new shape entirely. What had once been desert now formed an avenue of black stone leading toward the monolith, where the Overlord stood unmoving, its crown aflame with glyphs that burned brighter with every passing second. Around it, legions continued to rise, not dozens or hundreds, but thousands, their ranks filling the horizon. The ground beneath them ceased to resemble sand at all. It was a platform, an altar, a surface of alien construction stretching outward as far as the eye could see. The tomb had not awakened alone. The world itself was awakening with it. The transformation of the desert was no longer subtle. What had begun as cracks in the sand and glowing glyphs had become a full rebirth. Entire ridges of dunes collapsed inward, revealing vast staircases of black necrodermis that spiraled into subterranean depths. Obelisks taller than any cathedral rose in symmetrical patterns, their tips igniting with emerald flares that pulsed like beacons into the darkened sky. The desert was gone. In its place stood a city of the dead, not built but revealed, as though it had been waiting patiently beneath the surface all along. Chiron staggered from the trench, drawn forward despite the carnage, as though compelled by the enormity of what he witnessed. His fellow survivors clung to him, desperate to escape, but their flight paths always bent back toward the expanding necropolis. It was not chance. It was design. The structures were not rising randomly, but according to a pattern that herded every living thing into the same inevitable convergence. Escape was not being denied. It was being reshaped into ritual. He caught sight of a chimera transport, its engines screaming as it tore across the sands. Guardsmen clung to its hull, shouting orders drowned by the roar of its treads. For a heartbeat, hope surged. Perhaps some could escape, break through the encirclement, call for aid beyond the choking veil. Then a beam from an Immortal's blaster sheared the chimera cleanly in two, its front and rear sliding apart like butchered prey. The men upon it scattered into the air before being reduced to drifting ash. Hope died in the same instant, not in flames but in precision. Above the battlefield, the night scythes wove through the air in perfect arcs, their trajectories crossing with mechanical beauty, their green weapons carving sigils of death upon the sand. Each strike was not random but part of a greater pattern, each annihilation slotting into geometry that only the Necrons could comprehend. To the human eye it was massacre. To the Necrons it was choreography, the restoration of order to a surface long polluted by the living. The Overlord remained unmoving at the heart of it all. Its silence was heavier than any shouted command, its stillness a greater authority than any gesture. Around its feet, scarabs scuttled in swarms, rivers of chittering metallic bodies flowing over dunes and stone alike. They consumed everything they touched, weapons, armor, bones, and barricades alike. A ruined Lehman Russ tank vanished beneath their tide in less than a minute, its thick armor peeled apart like fruit skin, its machine spirit devoured without ceremony. What remained was not wreckage but nothingness, erasure given form. Chiron watched as the scarab swept closer, his breath shallow, his laser gun clutched with trembling hands. He could hear them, a million tiny jaws clicking in perfect synchronization, the sound drilling into his ears like ritual percussion. Every instinct screamed at him to fire, but he knew better now. He had seen lasfire dissolve against their carapaces, seen bolter shells shrugged off by bodies that refused destruction. To shoot was to waste the last measure of defiance he had. So he did not fire. He knelt, head bowed as though in prayer, and in that moment he wondered. Was this what the Emperor had promised? That humanity would endure, only to kneel before enemies older than the stars themselves? Or had the Imperial Creed always known that such horrors waited beneath the soil, and faith was merely a balm against inevitability? His thoughts blurred into fragments, prayers twisting into curses, curses dissolving into silence. Then, without warning, the scarabs stopped. The tide froze, every unit halting in perfect unity, their mandibles clicking once more in a single simultaneous bite. The sound echoed across the battlefield like the tolling of a bell. Above, the night scythes froze mid-flight, their engines holding steady, their wings glimmering with unearthly fire. Even the warriors, their gauze flares raised, ceased movement, locking into statuesque stillness. Only the Overlord moved, raising its staff for the first time. It turned its crown toward the heavens, the glyphs burning brighter than before. The green light lanced upward, piercing the artificial eclipse that smothered the stars. For a heartbeat, the veil cracked, revealing the void beyond. And in that void, Chiron saw shapes. Not one, not dozens, but hundreds. Other tomb ships, other monoliths awakening in concert. What he had thought the totality of the nightmare was only a fragment. The desert's tomb world was not alone. It was one voice in a chorus rising across the galaxy in unison. The realization hollowed him. His homeworld, his regiment, the Imperium itself, none of it mattered. For what hope could there be if all the tomb worlds awoke together? Even the Astartes, the Custodians, the Inquisition. What were they but candles against a storm that did not end? The Necrons were not an invasion. They were inevitability given flesh and metal. The staff lowered. The silence broke. The scarab surged forward again, the night scythe screamed. The warriors resumed their march. And in that instant, Chiron understood the true cruelty of it all. He had not been spared. He had been allowed to see, to witness, to carry the knowledge that the galaxy itself had never belonged to humanity, or to the Orcs, or to the Eldar. It had always belonged to the Necrons. And they had simply been patient enough to wait for their reclamation. When the scarabs reached him, he did not scream. His voice was already gone. Chapter 2. The collapse of Empire's news of Solus 47 never truly reached the wider Imperium. The garrison's last desperate vox bursts were swallowed in static, their final words rewritten into silence before they could cross the void. Yet silence carries its own message. And across Segmentum Solar, Segmentum Obscurus and far beyond, countless worlds felt the same trembling in their crust, the same sudden failures of Auspex and Cogitator, the same impossible glyphs etching themselves into the ground like wounds inflicted by memory. It was not one outpost that fell. It was thousands, scattered across the stars, all collapsing in the same hour. The Imperium, stretched thin across 1,000,000 worlds, reeled at once. Administratum scribes struggled to record the simultaneous silences, their parchment scrolls filling with red-inked designations of lost contact. 100 astropathic choirs cried out in unison as their souls shuddered against the void, some collapsing into seizures, others reduced to blind ruin. In the echo of their deaths, fragments of visions were scrawled on data slates, cities burning with green light, ships torn apart not by warp fire but by impossible geometry, warriors of bone and metal marching through temples defiled in perfect silence. On the shrine world of Carthium, pilgrims gathered in their millions to witness the opening of what they believed to be a new basilica. For centuries, a vast plain had been declared sacred ground, where foundations for the Emperor's glory were prepared, but never completed. On that day the earth split open, revealing not a basilica but a tomb complex that stretched for miles. The faithful cheered, mistaking the rising obelisks for a miracle, until the first salvo of Gauss fire reduced their bodies to drifting ash. Their hymns ended not with blasphemy but with nothingness. The Astra Militarum tried to respond. Orders flickered down the chain of command, demanding regiments mobilized to defend frontier worlds, but already the timelines were fractured. Entire battalions vanished before their transports could launch, annihilated in barracks that had become tomb entrances overnight. Fleet commanders received fragmented reports, but their Auspex arrays failed when entering contested systems. Ships vanished into silent voids where no vox signal returned, only static that throbbed with faint mechanical echoes, as though someone or something was listening. And in the heart of Mars, within the vaults of the Adeptus Mechanicus, alarm spread not through fear but through recognition. The Magi of the Red Planet had records, fragments of data buried so deeply they were regarded as near myth. The war in heaven, the Necrontier, the Citan, the machines of living metal. Some dismissed the rising reports as corrupted transmissions, Xenos myths re-emerging in distorted code. Others whispered the truth in Binharik, afraid to give it voice in human tongue, that the old enemies had returned and this time not piecemeal. All at once. All at once. On Forge worlds across the galaxy, Skitarii legions deployed, their precision a pale mirror of the enemy they sought to face. Cohorts marched into valleys of awakening necropolises, chanting machine prayers through vox grills as their galvanic rifles cracked in disciplined volleys. But the Necrons were not flesh to be worn down nor engines that could be hacked. Every volley of fire seemed to achieve nothing but delay. Every triumphant cheer was erased as fallen warriors reassembled themselves from shards. Tech priests screamed praises to the Omnissiah even as Gauss lightning dissolved, their bionics and flesh alike into dust that never touched the ground. The Imperium of Man has survived 10,000 years of unending war, and yet never before had it faced an enemy that awakened everywhere at once. Orcs rampage with fury, Tyranids devour with hunger, chaos corrupts with whispers, but the Necrons arrived with inevitability. There was no negotiation, no heraldry, no demand, only reclamation. And on Terra itself, far removed from the first strikes, the High Lords gathered in the Senatorum Imperialis. Fox reports flickered in the dim light of the chamber, showing worlds vanishing into green flame, orbital stations cracking like shells. The master of the Astra Militarum shouted for immediate mobilization. The fabricator general demanded escalation of all Mechanicus reserves, and the ecclesiarch declared a holy war unlike any other. Yet even as they argued, a darker understanding lingered at the edges of their minds. For every world reported lost, how many more were already gone? For every tomb that stirred, how many more waited beneath their own feet? In the depths of the palace where the custodians kept eternal vigil, whispers spread among the silent sisterhood. They felt the resonance through their null aura, a vibration that even the warp could not mask. They said it felt like the galaxy itself drawing breath, but no one dared speak aloud, the question trembling in every soul. Could even the Emperor himself withstand an enemy that sought not to conquer, but to erase? The collapse had begun, and it did not roar like a storm. It spread like a shadow, inevitable, patient, absolute. On the agri-world of Histora, dawn began with the harvest bells ringing, as they had for centuries. Farmers guided their servitors into the fields. Hymns to the Emperor carried on the wind between endless rows of wheat that shimmered beneath twin suns. It should have been a day like any other. But when the bells fell silent, the sound that replaced them was not song, nor storm, nor war as mortals understood it. It was the deep, resonant groan of earth splitting open. Whole tracts of farmland crumbled as if the soil itself had become liquid, swallowing grain, servitors, and men alike. From the abyss rose not water or magma, but black stone shaped into towering pylons, their sides carved with angular glyphs that pulsed with sickly emerald light. At first the farmers ran, dragging children and supplies toward the distant spires of their settlements. But before they reached the gates, the first Necron warrior emerged. It strode from the rising tomb with the same measured pace as its kin across the galaxy. Gauss flare held with unerring steadiness, eyelights burning with merciless awareness. The militia rallied in panic, armed with laslocks and stubbers long obsolete. They fired into the oncoming ranks, some managing to dent necrodermis with sheer volume. But the dents closed, the wounds rewove themselves, and the warriors marched on. Fields once golden with wheat were reduced to glassy wastelands, each stalk burned to ash by weapons that unmade rather than consumed. By dusk the settlements were gone, their walls dissolved, their churches leveled into seamless black stone that reflected no light. Where once a world had fed billions, now it was silent, its surface rewritten into geometry not meant for the living. Elsewhere, manufactorums screamed with klaxons as assembly lines faltered. On the forge world of Threxus, the Mechanicus labored frantically to rearm its Titan legions. Warhorns blared, and plasma reactors roared to life within hangars the size of mountains. For a moment it seemed the Imperium steel might answer the silence with fire. Then the tomb beneath the world's crust opened. Necron constructs the size of hab blocks clawed their way upward, shards of necrodermis snapping into shape as if recalled from memory. Canoptech spiders swarmed across manufactorum floors, dismantling engines of war before they could be deployed. Entire Titan hulls were reduced to skeletal frames, their machine spirits shrieking as they were devoured piece by piece. The Skitarii legions fought valiantly, galvanic rifles blazing, their vox chants rising in unison with binary prayers. Yet every volley was absorbed, every formation flanked by teleporting Necron strike teams that appeared as if reality itself had chosen their arrival points. The Forge's reactors went dark before the Titans could take their first steps. In orbit, Imperial Navy vessels attempted counter-strike bombardments. Macro cannons thundered, torpedo bays roared, and lance batteries lit the void. For a few fleeting hours the Void War was contested, the proud banners of the Imperium gleaming against alien fire. But Necron vessels did not burn as other ships burned. Their hulls split into shards when struck, only to reform in the same instant, their geometries rewriting themselves as though refusing the very concept of destruction. One cruiser commander swore his augurs had tracked a single enemy vessel existing in 3 places at once. Its position impossible to confirm, until it vaporized his ship with a single emerald beam. Throughout the segmentum, vox nets filled with screams and prayers. Pilgrims on transport ships begged the Emperor for deliverance, only to watch as entire convoys vanished into lightless voids without even the mercy of wreckage. Inquisitors scoured archives for evidence, demanding clarity from fragments of lore so ancient even the Ordo Xenos had treated them as legend. The word Necrons spread like a contagion, whispered at first, then spoken aloud, then shouted with the force of despair. But names are not weapons. To name them was to acknowledge that the Imperium, for all its strength, was not facing an invasion but a reckoning, on Cadia, even as the Blackstone pylons hummed with their eternal vigil against the warp. Soldiers looked to the stars and saw emerald flares spreading like plague across the night sky. Some believed the pylons themselves were part of the awakening, that the very foundations of their fortress world had been constructed not to defend humanity, but to serve as keys to a tomb they could never truly understand. Whether true or not, the fear sank deep, and for once even Cadians hesitated. And across the galaxy that doubt was growing, spreading faster than fire, deeper than faith. Entire systems whispered that the age of man was ending, not with the roar of chaos but with silence. A silence older than stars. On the hive world of Barathros, the collapse did not begin in the spires above, but in the depths below. Workers in the underhives had long whispered of caverns that stretched further than any drill could measure, shafts sealed off by administratum decree generations before. When the tremors began, the people thought first of collapse, of supports failing, of rockfalls crushing tens of thousands. But what rose from the abyss was no natural disaster. It was a tomb gate, its edges smooth and gleaming, its glyphs shimmering with a light that had never touched human eyes before. The first Necron warriors emerged in disciplined ranks, their feet striking sparks on stone floors worn by centuries of labor. Hive gangs met them with stubbers and chain blades, their defiance born not of courage but of desperation. The Necrons walked through them as one walks through mist, flesh, bone, and steel alike dissolved in Gauss fire. Entire hab blocks reduced to smooth ash-stained surfaces that reflected the light of emerald glyphs. Within hours, the underhive was gone. By the end of the day, the midhive followed, its manufactorums silenced, its hab units emptied in perfect symmetry. Refugees fled upward, clogging the transit spires, crying out to the arbitrators and enforcers for salvation. But the law was gone, stripped away in the tide of inevitability. When the Necrons reached the upper hive, the spires fell not with fire or explosion but with precision cuts. Each tower sliced apart as though removed from a blueprint. From orbit, the Imperial Navy tried to hold. Battleships filled the void, their lance batteries lighting the darkness with searing brilliance. For a moment it seemed Barathros might endure, shielded by the Emperor's steel. Then the Necron fleet arrived. They did not translate from the warp, no tear, no flicker, no distortion. They were simply there. Black crescent shapes, monolithic vessels that ignored void shields as if they were air. Emerald beams cut across the fleet, turning proud battleships into debris fields in seconds. Whole squadrons of escorts vanished in silence, their wreckage scattering like sparks from a dying flame. One ship, the Emperor's Judgment, fired a full broadside of torpedoes at the largest vessel, a warship the size of a small moon. The torpedoes struck true, detonating in gouts of plasma that should have torn through armor. Instead, the vessel rippled, its geometry folding in upon itself. The explosions vanished, not absorbed, not deflected, but erased. Moments later, the warship returned fire, and the Emperor's judgment ceased to exist. Not even fragments left to mark its passing. The reports reached Terra in fragments, each one arriving later than the last until even the astropaths fell silent. The Senatorum Imperialis convened again, their voices rising in panic cloaked as authority. The Lord Commander demanded total mobilization. The Ecclesiarch called for crusade. The Fabricator General spoke of forbidden weaponry buried in vaults sealed since the Dark Age of technology. And yet beneath the rhetoric lingered the unspoken truth. The Imperium was not fighting a war. It was witnessing a harvest. The Inquisition fractured along familiar lines. Some demanded exterminatus protocols for any world where Necron activity was suspected, to deny them resources even at the cost of billions of Imperial lives. Others argued such destruction was meaningless, for how could you deny to the Necrons what was already theirs? Rumors spread that entire Ordos had gone silent, their fortresses swallowed in the same hour by tomb complexes blooming from beneath their foundations. On the battlefields themselves, the collapse was more visceral. Astartes companies deployed, their drop pods screaming through atmospheres thick with smoke, their chainswords roaring, their bolters thundering. For a time they carved through Necron ranks with righteous fury. For a time it seemed the Emperor's angels might succeed where mortals failed. But every warrior slain reassembled, every victory dissolved, every line broken reformed. And when the Necron overlords strode forth, their scythes cutting through ceramite as though it were parchment, even the Adeptus Astartes faltered. In one Vox recording, recovered only as static-laced fragments, a captain of the Ultramarines spoke his last words. "We do not fight them. We fight time itself, and time does not bleed." His transmission ended in silence, followed by the faint hum of alien energy. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Tombs opened, worlds fell, fleets were erased, resistance dissolved. The Imperium was not losing battles, it was losing definition. The very map of the galaxy was being rewritten in green light, its borders erased, its empires reduced to whispers. And through it all, the Necrons did not speak. They did not boast. They did not demand surrender. They did not even acknowledge their enemies. They marched forward in silence because what need is there to speak when one is merely reclaiming what has always been one's own? The collapse did not unfold evenly. There were worlds that resisted longer, strongholds that stood defiant against the tide. On Armageddon, scarred by endless wars against orcs and chaos alike, the people did not flee when the tombs opened. They were a world accustomed to annihilation, its surface already burned black and cratered by ages of war. The Steel Legion mobilized within hours, their armored columns rolling out across ash wastes, their chimeras and Lehman Russ tanks spitting fire into the ranks of the awakening dead. From the skies, squadrons of thunderbolts screamed downward, unleashing payloads of Hellstrike missiles into the rising monoliths. For a time it seemed as though Armageddon might hold, as though sheer human defiance could resist inevitability. But even on Armageddon, the pattern unfolded. The first wave of Necron warriors fell in droves, only to rise again, their forms reconstituted by beams of green light emitted from hovering constructs. Monoliths hovered above the ash wastes, their faces glowing with power that bent the battlefield itself, pulling whole regiments into their portals and spitting them out as bone dust. Baneblades roared and shook the ground, their cannons cracking open the sky. But their shells struck hulls that healed as though time itself rewound. General Kurov ordered counteroffensives again and again, each one breaking on the same stone wall of inevitability. His last orders, recorded in fragmentary vox bursts, were not for victory but for remembrance. "If we fall," he said, his voice lost beneath the roar of weapons fire, "remember that we fought. Remember that Armageddon was never silent." Moments later the channel went dead. replaced by static laced with the rhythm of mechanical heartbeats. Elsewhere, resistance burned even brighter if only for a moment. On Baal, the Blood Angels rose to defend their home, their rage at the enemy feeding their fury. The sons of Sanguinius charged with wings of fire, their blades flashing in the light of a dying sun. They carved through Necron legions with a ferocity born of desperation, their death cries echoing across the sands. Yet even there, among the mightiest of the Emperor's chosen, the outcome never shifted. When the tombs opened in earnest, when the skies filled with crescent-shaped vessels, the fury of angels was reduced to silence. It was silence, more than destruction, that marked this collapse. Orcs bellow when they invade, their laughter rolling across battlefields. Tyranids devour with shrieks and roars, their hunger-made sound. Chaos howls with blasphemous laughter and the screams of the damned. But the Necrons bring nothing. When their wars end, there is only the hush of a world made empty, its surface unmarked save for geometry etched into its bones. The effect on the wider Imperium was profound. Faith thrives in fire and trial, in enemies that roar and blaspheme, against which the Emperor's faithful can set their hymns. But how do you sing against silence? On shrine worlds, ecclesiarchs led processions into tomb complexes, bearing relics and banners, chanting prayers that echoed off cold black walls. None returned. On frontier worlds, whole populations laid down their arms not from cowardice, but because they could not conceive of resisting inevitability. It was as if the galaxy itself had exhaled, and humanity was only dust in the breath. Yet still some fought, still some refused the shadow. Rogue traders gathered their fleets and struck at tomb complexes, their ships darting in and out of Necron-controlled systems, salvaging survivors where they could. Some Astartes chapters retreated into the void, becoming ghosts in their own right, striking like lightning before vanishing. Even the Inquisition, fractured and bleeding, refused to vanish entirely. Across the galaxy, fragments of resistance endured, not because they believed in victory, but because to stop fighting was to accept that humanity had never mattered. And in the halls of the Imperial Palace, beneath the watchful gaze of the Custodes, the High Lords at last admitted what no decree could hide. The Imperium was not at war with an enemy. It was watching the end of its age. The collapse of empires is rarely swift, but when it comes, it is absolute. And this collapse had only begun. There were some, however, who claimed to see in the collapse not the end, but the beginning of something older than humanity itself. Among the Ordo Xenos, certain inquisitors whispered of the war in heaven, of the Necron tears packed with the Citan, of wars fought before Terra knew the light of fire. They spoke in hushed tones of records found in Mechanicus vaults, of data scrolls that mapped tomb worlds with chilling precision, of symbols that matched across millennia. If the Necrons had awoken everywhere at once, then perhaps they had not awoken by chance. Perhaps the galaxy itself had reached a moment written into its bones. On Necromunda, a hive city built on greed and survival, gang wars ended not with bloodshed, but with silence. Entire hives collapsed inward as tomb structures pushed upward, their foundations splintered by geometry more ancient than stone. Those who survived the collapse did not flee. They knelt entranced before the rising structures, their minds blank with something deeper than fear. Some claimed the glyphs sang, though no sound was heard. Others said they saw visions. Worlds burning, stars dying, armies marching in endless silence. Whether madness or revelation, the effect was the same. Resistance bled away before it could even be tested. The collapse of empires does not mean only loss of land or armies. It is the erosion of identity. As tomb worlds multiplied, as fleets vanished, as faith faltered, the Imperium itself began to lose its shape. Administratum scribes no longer tried to record every lost planet. There were too many. Instead, they wrote single words across entire data slates. Silence, silence, silence. The maps of the Imperium became patchworks of emptiness, green light spreading across the void like a plague without cure. Even the warp seemed to respond. Astropaths reported strange disruptions, not demonic, not chaotic, but void-like. It was as if the psychic resonance of humanity's collective fear struck against something older, something that absorbed rather than reflected. Choirs screamed as messages failed, as if their voices were thrown into bottomless caverns. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Imperium feared not only the darkness of the warp, but the silence beyond it. And yet, even in collapse, defiance lingered. On Terra, the bells of the ecclesiarchy rang louder than ever. Pilgrims filled the streets crying out that the Emperor would rise, that his throne would burn with golden fire to erase the silence. The custodes did not join their voices, but their vigil grew tighter, their steps heavier, their weapons ready. In their silence was acknowledgement. Should the tombs open beneath the throne world itself, they would fight until the last. This was the paradox of collapse. In the face of inevitability, in the shadow of silence, humanity clung more fiercely to defiance. For every world that fell without a sound, another burned brighter in resistance, if only for a moment. For every imperial fleet dissolved in emerald light, another struck out into the void to fight, though they knew they could not win. It was not strategy. It was not survival. It was the essence of humanity itself, to rage even at the end. And so, as the Necrons marched across 1,000,000 worlds, as empires fractured and voices were silenced, one truth echoed louder than all others. The collapse had come. The Imperium was breaking. But even in breaking, it screamed. Chapter 3. The struggle for survival. The galaxy had fallen into a rhythm of silence and fire. Entire sectors slipped wordlessly into Necron hands, their populations erased as if they had never been. Yet across the void, sparks of resistance burned, small and fragile, but fierce in their defiance. These were not grand crusades or orchestrated campaigns, for the Imperium could no longer move with unity. Instead, survival fell to the scattered, the desperate, the few who understood that existence itself was the prize at stake. On the fortress world of Halcyon, survival began with refusal. The planet was built for war, its surface a lattice of bunkers, trenches, and void shield towers, its population bred to hold lines against any foe. When the tombs opened, disgorging endless ranks of metallic warriors, the Halcyonite Guard met them with the fury of a people who knew no life but battle. Lines of Lehman Russ tanks rolled forward across ash plains, their cannons hammering the Necron advance. Basilisk artillery screamed from distant redoubts, filling the air with storms of fire. In the skies, Valkyrie squadrons darted between emerald beams, ferrying reinforcements to collapsing lines. The fighting was not victory. It was attrition. It was survival. But on Halcyon, that was enough. Every hour the Guard held, another shuttle of refugees escaped the surface, bound for void stations waiting in orbit. The planet became a crucible where human defiance was burned into legend, its defenders fighting not to win, but to ensure that others might live. When the last bastion finally fell, it was buried beneath a storm of promethium fire, detonated by its own defenders to deny the Necrons their prize. Survivors whispered that the Emperor himself had looked upon Halcyon, not with sorrow but with pride. Elsewhere, survival took stranger forms. Rogue traders, accustomed to threading the razor's edge between law and heresy, became lifelines for entire systems. Their fleets darted through warp routes abandoned by the Imperial Navy, scavenging supplies, evacuating refugees, striking where Necron presence was weakest. Some betrayed their charges, selling lives for profit, abandoning worlds for safer routes. Others embraced the chaos, building alliances between shattered regiments, civilian flotillas, and even Xenos bands desperate enough to resist annihilation. For the first time in living memory, humans found themselves fighting beside Eldar corsairs, Kroot mercenaries, and other outcasts bound not by trust, but by the mutual knowledge that silence would erase them all. On frontier colonies, survival was even more primal. Families fled into the wilderness, abandoning manufactorums and settlements, hiding in caverns and forests where Necron patrols were less likely to tread. They built fires that smoked low, whispered their prayers in silence, and taught their children to run at the first gleam of emerald light. For these scattered survivors, existence became mythic. They told stories of heroes who would come, Astartes, custodians, or the Emperor himself, to deliver them from silence. Whether those heroes ever arrived did not matter. The stories kept them alive, kept them human. Among the Astartes, survival was never enough, but it was all that remained. Entire chapters found themselves reduced to fragments, their fleets shattered, their fortresses turned into tombs. Yet those fragments fought with a desperation even they had never known. Strike forces darted into Necron-held space, striking at tomb complexes, recovering relics, destroying awakening constructs before they could emerge in full. They fought not to win the war, but to buy time, to keep the silence from spreading just one world further. For the Astartes, survival was sacrifice, and sacrifice was duty. And always the question lingered. What did it mean to survive when survival itself seemed only a delay? Could humanity endure if every battle was fought only to stave off the inevitable? On 1,000 worlds, the answer came the same. So long as even one voice defied the silence, survival was enough. The galaxy learned quickly that survival was not a single battle won, nor a fortress held, but a shifting state of endurance, fragile as glass and fleeting as breath. On the hive world of Draxium, survival took the shape of the underhive, where billions crammed themselves into tunnels that had once been sewers, transitways, and abandoned manufactorums. Above them, the Necrons scoured the spires with systematic precision, slicing away levels as though dismantling a diagram. Yet in the darkness below, humanity clung to life, building new societies from rubble. Gangs became militias, arbitrators became warlords, and preachers became leaders of desperate cults, promising their flocks that the Emperor's light still reached them, even beneath layers of stone and ash. It was a hollow hope, yet it served its purpose. In the flickering light of makeshift shrines, children were taught hymns, weapons were passed hand to hand, and voxcasters relayed fragments of resistance propaganda. Every day was a gamble, every hour a victory. When Necron patrols descended, whole settlements scattered into side passages, vanishing like smoke, returning only when the machines had passed. Some even struck back, ambushing isolated warriors, dismantling them with crude charges and scavenged tools. Victories measured in single kills and hours of delay became legends that kept millions alive a little longer. Elsewhere, survival grew stranger still. On the ocean world of Vera, whole populations fled beneath the waves, hiding in submersible habitats designed centuries before as research stations. The Necrons scoured the land masses with emerald fire, leaving glassy plains where once forests had grown. But beneath the waves, the refugees endured. They told themselves the tombs would not seek the ocean depths, that the waters might shield them. Yet even there, survival was tenuous. From the abyssal trenches, vast constructs began to stir. Canoptech monstrosities designed to burrow, dismantle, and cleanse. When the first of these reached the domes, whole settlements were ripped apart, their remains swallowed in silence. But some endured, moving deeper, scattering wider, determined to outlast the machines that hunted them. Inquisitors, too, redefined survival. Some abandoned the pretense of saving entire worlds, choosing instead to preserve knowledge, artifacts, or individuals whose survival might shape the future. Entire regiments were sacrificed to hold Necron forces at bay, while a single scholar, a single relic, or a single data slate was carried into the void. To many, these acts seemed monstrous, but to the Inquisition, survival was not measured in bodies. It was measured in secrets, in slivers of hope that might one day arm humanity with the tools to endure. Survival was not always noble. On countless worlds, desperation bred betrayal. Civilians were sold to Necron patrols in exchange for a few more hours of safety. Guard officers abandoned their regiments, fleeing with supplies into the wilderness. Even Astartes were not immune to despair. Some vanished into the void. Their banners struck, their vows dissolved in the hopelessness of inevitability. Yet even in this, survival remained. Broken, stained, and dishonored, but survival all the same. And then there were those who turned survival into something more. Eldar raiding fleets, scattered and desperate as any humans, struck back with precision, carving open Necron patrol routes, disrupting their tomb awakenings, buying humanity brief reprieves. In return, human survivors offered them shelter, fuel, even kinship, alliances unthinkable in earlier ages. For the first time in millennia, the galaxy saw a strange convergence. Enemies bound by extinction itself, surviving together not out of trust but necessity. Everywhere, the question returned, was survival enough? Could endurance in the face of inevitability be called victory, or was it merely prolonging the silence? The answer, fragile as a candle in the void, burned still. To live another day was to deny the Necrons their absolute claim. To endure was itself defiance, and in a galaxy being consumed, defiance was survival's truest form. On the death world of Corvallis, survival was not merely a human endeavor, but a contest of ecosystems. The Necrons emerged from beneath jungles where every tree dripped poison, every insect carried venom, and every beast was a predator. At first their march was unstoppable, scouring the canopy with beams of emerald light, reducing whole swaths of forest to sterile glass. Yet the planet itself resisted, vines as strong as steel wrapped around mechanical limbs, dragging warriors into sinkholes. Predatory beasts hurled themselves against metal hides, their claws snapping but their frenzy unyielding. The Necrons slaughtered them by the thousands, yet for each creature dissolved, a dozen more swarmed forward. Humanity, hiding within this nightmare of nature, learned to use the world itself as ally. Small bands of hunters struck at the fringes of Necron formations, luring them into bogs where their weight dragged them beneath, or into thickets where even machines could not move without resistance. To the survivors, this was not victory but a strange pact. Man and nature against inevitability, a temporary reprieve won by the fury of a world that had never tolerated invaders. Tales spread that Corvallis might endure longer than any fortress, not through walls or weapons, but through the wrath of its soil. In orbit, survival wore another face. Vast flotillas of refugee ships drifted through void lanes abandoned by the Imperial Navy. Their hulls were patched with scrap, their engines barely functioning, their holds packed with the remnants of entire civilizations. Within their decks, survival was chaos and misery, starvation, plague, riots. Priests screamed litanies into the void, holding aloft relics to remind their charges that the Emperor still saw them. Some ships vanished into silence without enemy fire, consumed by their own desperation. Others, against all odds, endured, limping from system to system, searching for worlds untouched by green light. Sometimes they found them. Isolated moons, barren rocks, half-dead planets became sanctuaries, populated by those too desperate to care about comfort. They dug shelters, erected shrines, and built the bare bones of new societies. For those who survived, the galaxy itself had shrunk, Survival no longer meant holding empires or cities, but breathing air for one more day beneath a foreign sky. Among the Astartes, survival became something harsher still. Scattered companies fought wars of shadow, striking like ghosts against tomb complexes, destroying pylons, sabotaging awakening fleets. They fought not for conquest but for delay. Records tell of a single company of the Raven Guard that fought an entire campaign across 3 systems, never holding ground, never seeking battle, only sabotaging supply lines and striking at vulnerable nodes. For every hour they endured, thousands of civilians escaped into the void. When at last they fell, their sacrifice had bought not victory but survival, which was all that remained. Even within the Imperium's most hallowed halls, survival reshaped faith. Ecclesiarchs declared that survival itself was sacred, that to endure in silence was proof of the Emperor's hand. Sermons rang out not only in cathedrals but in ruins and caverns, aboard shattered ships drifting between stars. The message was the same. If humanity still lived, then humanity still mattered. It was a fragile creed, yet one that spread quickly, becoming the heart of resistance across entire sectors. But survival was a knife's edge. For every world that endured, 10 more were erased. For every refugee fleet that found shelter, dozens vanished into nothingness. For every Astartes strike that bought time, another fortress monastery fell silent. The struggle for survival was constant, consuming, unending. And still the question lingered. How long could defiance last before silence swallowed it whole? The most desperate struggles for survival unfolded not on worlds or fleets, but in the minds of those who lived through the collapse. On the shrine moon of Calves, where 1 billion pilgrims once gathered each year, the Necrons arrived with their usual inevitability. Cities fell, cathedrals dissolved into dust, and the great basilica of St. Chiron was split in 2 by a single sweep of emerald fire. Yet within the catacombs below, tens of thousands of pilgrims survived. They crowded together in the dark, pressing relics to their lips, reciting prayers until their throats were raw. Days became weeks, supplies dwindled, disease spread. Still they endured. To breathe was to pray. To last another hour was to offer proof that humanity could not yet be erased. When the Necrons finally breached the catacombs, they found not armies but families, children clutching icons, mothers whispering the Emperor's name as if the word itself might shield them. The slaughter was inevitable, but so too was the echo. Astropaths across the sector felt a sudden surge of faith, a psychic flare of defiance so strong that even as the pilgrims died, their will carried outward. On distant worlds, men and women claimed to feel it, a warmth that whispered survival was still possible. The pilgrims of Calves had perished, but their endurance had become a weapon more enduring than flesh. Other stories carried a darker edge. On the mining world of Dravak, the planetary governor abandoned his people, sealing himself within orbital stations, while billions starved below. In their desperation, the miners turned to ancient vaults, opening chambers long forbidden by imperial decree. What they found were remnants of human technology predating the Imperium, weapons half understood, machines that could wound even Necron metal. They fought like cornered animals, wielding fire they barely controlled. Entire cities burned, their skies blackened, but for a time Dravak survived. When the Necrons finally overcame them, the world was so scarred and poisoned it could yield nothing. The survivors were gone, but their refusal had denied the enemy's harvest. Survival also meant remembering. Inquisitors and Mechanicus Magi hoarded fragments of data, preserving records of each resistance, each defiance, each fleeting victory. Data slates carried across void ships told stories of Halcyon sacrifice, Corvallis's wrathful wilderness, Calvus's faithful, Dravak's fire. These stories became as vital as weapons, binding survivors together, reminding them that humanity was still more than silence. Entire regiments fought not for themselves, but to ensure their struggle would be remembered, to carve defiance into the galaxy's memory even if their bodies fell. But survival, for all its power, was not without cost. Billions lived like ghosts, wandering ruins, scavenging the barest sustenance, clinging to existence without hope of victory. Some questioned whether survival itself was worth the suffering, whether it was nobler to embrace silence than to prolong agony. Yet even here a stubborn truth remained. As long as one voice still spoke the Emperor's name, humanity had not yet been erased. Thus the galaxy entered a new age, not of conquest nor dominion but of survival itself. Every ember of resistance burned with the same message. Silence could be endured. For a day, a week, a year, survival was its own kind of victory. Chapter 4. Whispers of the Eternal. As the Imperium reeled beneath the weight of survival, another struggle began to stir, one not waged with bolters or lasguns, but with memory, rumor, and faith. Across a galaxy consumed by silence, voices began to whisper of truths too vast, too ancient, and too dangerous to name. These whispers did not come from generals or priests, but from survivors who claimed to have seen patterns in the emerald light, from scholars who unearthed forbidden archives, from psychers whose visions cut through the veil of time. In the struggle for survival, humanity had clung to existence. In the age of whispers, it began to ask what survival meant at all. Among the Ordo Xenos, the whispers were fiercest. Inquisitors spoke in private conclaves, their words drowned in static wards to prevent the warp from carrying them outward. They recalled half-forgotten fragments, tales of the war in heaven, of the Necrontiers pact with the Citan, of living metal armies that had once fought gods and reshaped the stars. Some argued that the awakening was not random, that the simultaneity of it was not chaos but design. Perhaps the Necrons had chosen this moment not to conquer, but to reclaim the galaxy itself. Perhaps the silence was not war at all, but inevitability written in the bones of time. The Adeptus Mechanicus too felt the pull of these whispers. Deep within Martian archives, buried beneath layers of code and wards, lay ancient warnings. Data scrolls from the dark age of technology spoke of machines that could not be destroyed, only delayed, of structures buried beneath half the known galaxy. Magi debated whether the Necrons were merely reclaiming their ancient dominion, or whether something deeper stirred beneath the surface. Some even whispered that the pylons of Cadia, once thought weapons against the warp, were Necron in origin. Not gifts of the Emperor, but remnants of an age-long past. If true, then humanity had been sheltered not by divine providence, but by the very enemy now consuming them. But the whispers were not confined to halls of power. On 1,000 worlds, refugees spoke of visions. Pilgrims claimed to see figures of green fire walking through their dreams. Psychers muttered of voices too ancient to be demonic, cold and vast as the void. Some declared that the Necrons were not conquerors but custodians, reclaiming a galaxy that had never belonged to man. Others swore the machines were heralds, that their silence meant not annihilation, but preparation for something greater, something that lay beyond even the warp. Ecclesiarchs declared such whispers heresy, stamping them out with fire and sword. Yet even as cathedrals burned with accused dreamers inside, the rumors spread faster. Faith had always been the Imperium's greatest weapon, but faith itself was beginning to fracture. Was survival proof of the Emperor's light, or was it merely delay before the inevitable silence of the Necrons? Could humanity still be chosen if the galaxy itself seemed to deny their dominion? And through it all, the custodians of Terra remained silent. In their golden armor they stood unmoved, their vigil unbroken. Yet among the silent sisterhood rumors spread. Some sisters claimed they could feel the weight of the Necron advance in their null auras, a resonance unlike any warp echo. To them it was not malice, not hunger, but inevitability. As if the galaxy itself were breathing out and humanity was caught in the exhalation. Whispers are fragile, but in a collapsing galaxy, they grew into something vast. They became liturgy, prophecy, madness, and hope all at once, for in the shadow of silence, humanity began to wonder whether its struggle for survival was merely a prelude to a truth too great to face. On the fringe world of Helior, whispers became something more. A band of survivors claimed to have seen the awakening of a tomb world not from orbit, but from the surface itself. They described emerald pylons rising like skeletal fingers, humming with energy that made the air burn cold. Yet when the Necrons marched forth, the survivors swore they saw not soldiers but statues. Silent guardians standing motionless as if waiting for something. They told of a single moment when the sky itself seemed to fracture, constellations bending and twisting as if the galaxy's very map was being rewritten. Most dismissed the tale as hallucination, the delusion of starving men. Yet the story spread, carried from system to system, whispered in the corners of void ships. Perhaps the Necrons were not here to destroy, but to reshape. On other worlds, whispers took a darker turn. Astropaths across the segmentum solar reported visions of vast engines burning with green light. Machines that stretched across entire systems, their purpose beyond comprehension. Some claimed these engines were reshaping reality itself, not through the warp but through something deeper, something that stripped even demons of power. Others swore the visions meant the Astronomicon itself would soon fail, swallowed not by chaos but by silence so pure that no psychic beacon could pierce it. To some this was despair. To others it was liberation. The idea that humanity might finally be free of the warp's endless hunger, even if it meant ceasing to exist. The whispers also found their way into the ecclesiarchy, twisting faith into new forms. Preachers who had once spoken of the Emperor's wrath now spoke of his silence, declaring that the Necron advance was part of his divine plan. They claimed the machines were his instruments, purging the galaxy of weakness so that only the most faithful would remain. These sects grew rapidly, fed by desperation and terror, spreading across hive cities and refugee flotillas alike. The ecclesiarch denounced them as heretics, burning them by the thousands, yet their numbers only grew. Faith had become a battlefield of its own, and whispers were its weapons. Even within the Astartes, doubt took root. Some chapters, shattered and scattered, began to record fragments of the whispers in their own libraria. Noting patterns between visions across different systems, librarians reported echoes in the warp that matched no demonic signature, a silence that moved like a tide. They spoke of green constellations that flared in psychic sight, constellations that mirrored Necron glyphs carved into the walls of tombs. To warriors bred for certainty, these revelations were poison. Yet to some, they were a new kind of hope, the belief that perhaps humanity was witnessing not an end, but a transformation, a shift into something they could not yet comprehend. And beyond even rumor, there were the moments of contact. On the mining moon of Devarik 9, a group of enslaved humans swore they were not slaughtered by their Necron captors, but ignored. They described laboring beneath the gaze of towering constructs who neither struck nor spoke, who simply allowed them to toil. To some this was mockery. To others it was proof that humanity was not the true target. Perhaps the Necrons did not even see mankind as an enemy, but as insects irrelevant to their true design. That idea was more terrifying than conquest. For how does one fight an enemy who does not even acknowledge the battle? Thus the whispers grew, not in clarity but in confusion, 1,000 voices telling 1,000 stories. Some promised salvation, others annihilation, others truths so strange they could not be named. Yet all carried the same weight. Humanity was no longer the center of the galaxy's story. The stars themselves seemed to bend toward the Necrons, as if the eternal war between man and Xenos had always been nothing but an echo of something far greater. On the agri-world of Veyruun, the whispers became prophecy. Farmers who once tilled fields of grain beneath a yellow sun began to gather at night, staring skyward as if waiting for a signal. They claimed the stars themselves spoke, arranging in patterns that resembled Necron glyphs. One by one, villages abandoned their labor, kneeling in the fields beneath constellations only they could read. Imperial authorities declared mass hysteria, a symptom of famine and fear. Yet when the tombs beneath Veyruun stirred, those same villagers marched willingly toward the emerging structures, their faces serene, their hands empty. They did not scream when the Necrons came. They did not flee. They walked into the emerald light as if it were a long-awaited dawn. To those who survived on the outskirts, the sight was worse than slaughter. For death at least could be resisted, but surrender to silence felt like the unraveling of the soul itself. Such stories traveled faster than any fleet. Rogue traders whispered of worlds where entire populations vanished overnight, not through fire but through obedience. No resistance, no battle. Only the quiet filing of humanity into tomb cities never to be seen again. Some claimed these people had been remade, their flesh transformed into something metallic, their eyes burning with soulless green. Others said they had simply ceased, erased as though they had never been. The truth was uncertain, but the fear was undeniable. Perhaps the Necrons were not merely killing, but assimilating, rewriting humanity into something unrecognizable. Within the Scholastica Psychana, whispers became warnings. Sanctioned psychers across dozens of sectors reported visions of a vast silence rolling outward, extinguishing the warp itself. They spoke of demons howling in confusion, of chaos gods retreating into their own realms as their grasp on reality weakened. To the Imperium, such visions should have been hope. Yet hope twisted into dread. For if the warp itself could be silenced, then so too could the Astronomicon, the Emperor's light that bound humanity together. For every psyker who claimed silence was liberation, another whispered that it was oblivion. The Ordo Hereticus silenced them with fire, but their voices lingered in memory, becoming yet more fragments of the growing chorus. Even the Necrons themselves seemed to feed the whispers. Survivors reported rare instances where the machines did not slaughter but spoke, not in human language nor even in sound, but in pulses of energy that filled the air with meaning too vast for comprehension. Some claimed to feel messages pressed directly into their minds, impressions of eternity, of cycles too old for words, of galaxies bending and unbending like reeds in a cosmic wind. Few could endure the experience without madness. Yet those who survived often emerged changed, speaking in riddles, drawing glyphs they had never learned, whispering of patterns that stretched across the void. These broken prophets became both feared and revered, their madness treated as revelation by those desperate for answers. What terrified the Imperium most was not the content of the whispers, but their consistency. Across sectors separated by light years, across worlds with no contact, survivors reported visions that echoed one another. The same constellations described, the same glyphs drawn, the same sense that humanity's time was not ending by chance but by design. It was as though the galaxy itself had begun to whisper in one voice, and that voice was not human. The High Lords of Terra ordered silence, decreeing that all such rumors were lies, heresies meant to sap morale. Yet even on Terra, in the shadow of the Golden Throne, whispers seeped through. Pilgrims knelt before statues of the Emperor not to pray for salvation, but to beg for answers. What if humanity was never the chosen inheritor of the stars? What if their survival, their empires, their endless wars, had always been nothing more than a pause between Necron dominions? What if the Emperor's light was not salvation, but defiance against inevitability? The questions themselves were poison, yet they spread, unstoppable as the green tide itself. On the forge world of Desmian, whispers became calculation. The magi of the cult Mechanicus gathered in secret conclaves, poring over fragments of Necron technology seized in desperate battles. They dissected shards of living metal, catalogued the harmonic frequencies of gauss fire, and mapped the resonances of tomb pylons against the known geometry of the galaxy. What they found shook even their logic-bound hearts. The structures of the Necrons were not merely weapons. They were patterns, repeating themselves across planets and stars, echoes of a design too vast for coincidence. To the Magi, it appeared as though the Necrons were not invading but tuning the galaxy, bending reality into some greater symmetry. Some whispered that the entire Imperium, perhaps even the warp itself, was nothing but interference, noise to be purged until only the perfect signal remained. Among the black ships, whispers spread like contagion. Captive psychers, their minds aflame with visions, cried out of emerald suns and silent gods walking between stars. Their wails filled the holds, driving their handlers to despair. Some claimed to see the Emperor himself standing upon the golden throne, not in glory but in struggle, as though even his vast psychic power strained against the silence pressing inward. The Inquisition dismissed such claims as blasphemy, executing psychers by the thousands. Yet the memory of their screams lingered, feeding the sense that the galaxy was moving toward some convergence too great to resist. On Cadril's Hope, a world of refugees and broken regiments, whispers took another shape. Soldiers scarred by retreat began to dream the same dream. In it, they stood upon battlefields not of mud and fire, but of glass and light, locked in combat alongside figures they could not name. Some swore they saw ancient warriors clad in gold and silver, wielding weapons that bent time itself. Others saw the Emperor not seated but walking, his face shrouded in radiance, his voice lost but his presence undeniable. They woke in terror yet also in wonder. Had they glimpsed the past when the war in heaven first raged? Or the future, when humanity would either rise to match eternity or vanish into silence? The whispers had no single meaning. For some they were hope, the belief that humanity was part of a cycle older than the stars, destined to endure beyond even the Necrons. For others they were despair, proof that man was nothing more than dust in the shadow of ancient gods. Yet what bound them together was their persistence. No decree, no censure, no pyre could erase them. Like the green light that marched across the void, they spread, seeping into every world, every prayer, every dream, and in the darkest places, in the hidden archives of the Inquisition and the Mechanicus, a final whisper emerged. Fragments of data, scraps of vision, hints buried in forgotten liturgies all suggested the same forbidden truth. The Necrons had not all awakened yet. What the galaxy faced was not their full strength, but only the first stirrings of eternity. The silence that had fallen was not the end. It was the beginning. Chapter Phi, The Shape of the End. The galaxy had grown accustomed to endings. Empires fell, species burned, worlds turned to ash, and still life staggered onward. But as the Necrons advanced without pause, as the whispers deepened into prophecy, it became clear that this ending was different. It was not the collapse of a single realm, nor the devouring hunger of chaos, nor even the green tide of orcs. It was silence made manifest, inevitability given form. The shape of the end was not fire nor rage, but stillness, an end that did not roar but simply erased. On the throne world of Terra, the High Lords debated endlessly, their chambers heavy with incense and fear. Some demanded the mobilization of every remaining fleet, every Astra Militarum regiment, every fragment of strength to strike at the tomb worlds before the silence spread further. Others argued that war was meaningless, that humanity's only hope lay in retreat, in hiding among the void until the storm had passed. None dared voice the deepest fear, that there was no storm, only the new order of the galaxy, and that humanity itself was already obsolete. The custodians stood their eternal watch, silent as statues, their golden eyes betraying nothing. Yet even they, it was said, walked the palace halls with heavier steps, as if the very foundations of their duty trembled. Across the segmentum obscurus, survivors began to see patterns in the destruction. Tomb worlds did not awaken at random. They rose in arcs, in spirals, in geometries that no human cartographer could explain, but that repeated with terrifying precision. It was as though the Necrons were not conquering but drawing. Each world erased was another line in a design too vast for mortals to see. The Mechanicus whispered that perhaps the galaxy itself was being rewritten, reshaped into a lattice that would choke the warp, cage the stars and leave only silence in its wake, and yet, even in the face of such inevitability, resistance flared. Entire worlds lit themselves with fire, detonating reactors rather than letting their people be erased. Fleets hurled themselves into battles they could not win, fighting not for survival but to leave a mark upon the silence. Astartes chapters, shattered and dying, launched their final crusades, carving paths of blood across the stars, desperate to prove that humanity's end would not be meek. Their defiance was both futile and magnificent, the last flickering sparks of a species that refused to go quietly. But the shape of the end was not only destruction. It was transformation. Across the galaxy, those touched by whispers began to act with strange purpose. Cults of silence spread, not out of fear but out of awe, proclaiming that humanity was being invited into eternity. Mechanicus enclaves secretly turned their forges to the study of Necron relics, no longer to destroy them, but to emulate them. Even among the ecclesiarchy, voices rose declaring that perhaps the Emperor's true plan was not victory but transcendence, that the Necrons themselves were his instruments, reshaping creation for a destiny beyond comprehension. Whether these were revelations or delusions, none could say, but they carried with them a single terrible possibility, that the end was not an end at all, but a rewriting of everything humanity had ever known. And still, the golden throne burned. The Astronomicon flared, though weaker than before, its light flickering against the encroaching silence. Billions looked upward and prayed, not for victory, not even for survival, but for meaning, for the assurance that the end, whatever its shape, was not empty. For in the cold advance of the Necrons, that was the greatest terror of all. Not that humanity would die, but that humanity would not matter. On the fortress world of Talvarn, the end took the shape of sacrifice. The world's defense grid, an array of void shields and lance batteries that had withstood orcs, tyranids, and even the tides of chaos, shuddered beneath the cold precision of Necron fire. For weeks the defenders held. Trenches burned with las fire, skies screamed with flak, and the chant of the Imperial Creed rolled across Vox networks to steady faltering hearts. Yet the Necrons did not waver. They did not hunger, did not tire, did not bleed. They advanced in endless ranks, their weapons carving Talvarn's mountains into smooth glass. When at last the shield generators failed, the people of Talvarn did not flee. They detonated their own munitions, igniting the planet's core, turning their home into a star that burned for only a moment in the void. It was not victory, it was not even survival, but in that one instant of fire, they denied silence, and their story became part of the Imperium's defiant memory. Elsewhere, the end was quieter. On the pleasure world of Kithris, where nobles once drowned themselves in excess, the Necrons emerged without resistance. Palaces fell in silence. Noble blood spilled across marble halls, and there was no final blaze of defiance, only the stilling of laughter and the cooling of wine. Survivors who fled spoke of the emptiness more than the slaughter. The world had not died screaming but sighing, fading like a candle in a cavern too vast for its light to matter. The Imperium grieved Talvarn as a martyr, but it forgot Kitharus within a generation. Such was the shape of the end. Some burned bright before silence, others vanished into it without leaving a trace. Yet across both triumph and surrender, rumors of patterns persisted. Astropaths claimed that every death, every silence, every fire became part of a tapestry they could not fully see. Worlds that burned seemed to flare within the warp like sparks against a tide, while those that faded quietly left no mark at all. Some scholars dared to suggest that perhaps humanity's resistance mattered less in survival than in resonance. That each act of defiance, each prayer, each scream carved something indelible into the fabric of existence. If true, then the shape of the end was not silence alone, but a contest of memory. The Necrons sought to erase, while humanity sought to be remembered. Inquisitors seized upon this idea, some to weaponize it, others to bury it. Radical factions whispered that humanity's only hope lay in embracing martyrdom on a galactic scale, ensuring that the warp itself was so saturated with human defiance that it could never be silenced. Others recoiled, horrified by the thought of orchestrating species-wide annihilation as strategy. Yet even the rejection of such whispers betrayed their power. The Imperium had begun to imagine its end not as defeat but as legacy. And beyond the Imperium, alien eyes watched. Orcs drawn to the greatest wars hurled their fleets against Necron phalanxes, their laughter ringing even as their hulks dissolved under Gauss fire. Tyrannid hive fleets shifted course, their tendrils recoiling from tomb worlds as though recognizing something even they could not consume. Eldar seers spoke of doom long foretold, of a cycle older than their race, their voices breaking with sorrow as they admitted that even their gods had no answers. The galaxy itself seemed to bend toward stillness. Every species confronted with the possibility that the Necrons were not invaders, but the architects of destiny. And yet, for all the inevitability of silence, humanity remained what it had always been, stubborn, fractured, unyielding in spirit if not in strength. The shape of the end might be silence, but within that silence, the Imperium still screamed. In the void between stars, where refugee flotillas drifted like wounded animals, the end took the shape of memory. Entire generations were born and died aboard ships that never touched ground, their holds filled with whispered stories instead of food. Elders recited tales of worlds long lost, of victories that had once seemed eternal, of the Emperor's radiance blazing brighter than any star. Children listened not as historians but as heirs, inheriting a lineage of defiance carried only in words. On ships that would never see Terra, that would never glimpse the Astronomicon again, survival was found not in weapons or rations but in memory itself. If the Necrons sought to silence, then every whispered story was rebellion, every remembered name a blade against eternity. On Terra, the shape of the end took the form of ritual. Pilgrims filled the streets of the imperial palace's shadow, their voices raw from endless chants. They prayed not for deliverance but for significance, that if this was the last age of mankind, the Emperor would hold their names in his eternal flame. Ecclesiarchs thundered from pulpits, their sermons growing stranger, half litanies, half pleas, as if they too sought meaning more than salvation. Even the custodians, silent as ever, were seen to pause at shrines as they passed, bowing their heads for a heartbeat before resuming their vigil. Such moments, small and fleeting, became relics to those who saw them, proof that even the Golden Warriors feared the silence drawing near. In the warp, the end shaped itself in echoes. Demons shrieked and recoiled, not from banishment but from absence. Great rifts that had once boiled with chaos fury fell quiet, their storms dissolving into stillness. Astropaths who gazed too long into that silence returned broken, whispering of structures in the void, lattices that drank thought itself. Some declared this the Emperor's triumph, proof that the Necrons were unwitting servants of his plan, scouring the warp clean for his apotheosis. Others cried that it was the death of all things, the extinguishing not only of humanity but of spirit itself. The whispers did not agree, but they multiplied, adding new layers to the chorus that surrounded every act of resistance. The shape of the end was also choice. On worlds cut off from the Imperium, governors and generals stood before their people and declared their final paths. Some vowed to fight until every stone was dust, every soul burned into the warp as defiance. Others chose surrender, hoping their submission might grant survival even if twisted into something unrecognizable. Still others chose exile, abandoning their homes to drift among the stars, gambling that somewhere beyond the green tide, a sanctuary remained. Each choice carried its own kind of courage, its own kind of doom, and in the vast tapestry of the galaxy, each became another thread in the shape of the end. But the most haunting shape was rumor itself. Whispers grew of a final convergence, a moment when every tomb would stand open, when the patterns of silence would complete their lattice. Some said it would come as a sudden stilling of the Astronomicon, a final extinguishing of light. Others claimed it would be heralded by the Emperor himself, rising from the throne to face the silence as he had once faced the gods of old. None knew which, if either, was true. But as more and more systems fell, as the spirals of Necron awakening drew closer to Terra, the galaxy began to live not in the present, but in anticipation, waiting for the moment when the shape of the end would at last be revealed. On the shattered husk of Armageddon, where fire and smoke had once wreathed unending wars, the shape of the end became a monument. The Necrons swept across the ruins with merciless precision, stripping away the last remnants of orc fortresses and human citadels alike. Yet when the final bastion fell, they did not erase the world completely. Instead, they left standing a single ruin, the skeletal frame of Hive Hellsreach blackened and broken. Survivors whispered that it was no accident. Perhaps the Necrons had chosen to preserve it, not as mercy but as record, a monument to futility, a reminder that even humanity's fiercest battlefields could not escape silence. Pilgrims later crept back to that ruin, kneeling among the shattered stones, declaring that if even silence preserved memory, then memory itself could not be killed. The Eldar, fragmented and fading, saw in the Necron advance the culmination of their most ancient prophecies. Seer councils whispered that the war in heaven had never truly ended, that the galaxy was only now reaching its destined symmetry. To them, humanity's empire was a brief interlude, a flicker of light between two eternities. Yet among their despair, some spoke of a sliver of possibility, that perhaps by enduring humanity could inherit more than survival. That in defiance of inevitability, they might claim a place within the pattern, carving themselves into eternity not as masters, but as witnesses. It was a fragile hope, but one that resonated with those who had long lived in the shadow of doom. On Terra, the shape of the end drew nearer with every hour. Astropathic choirs reported the silence pressing against the edges of the segmentum solar, their voices faltering as if swallowed mid-song. Fleets gathered in a last desperate defense, their admirals knowing they could not hold. The High Lords issued decrees calling for unity, but their voices trembled beneath the weight of inevitability. And still the people prayed, filling the hive cities with hymns that rolled like thunder across the polluted skies. They did not pray for victory. They prayed to be remembered. And in the deepest chamber of the imperial palace upon the golden throne the emperor endured. His body was withered, his light flickering, his will bound to a machine that devoured thousands of souls each day. Yet across the galaxy, psychers claimed to feel his presence flare stronger than ever before. Some said he stirred, his awareness pressing against the silence. Others swore his voice whispered through their dreams not with words but with the simple command to endure. Whether this was truth or madness, no one could say. But for a moment the whispers of the galaxy converged, not upon the Necrons, not upon the silence, but upon him. The Emperor, silent for 10,000 years, became the last whisper of mankind. And so the shape of the end was revealed not as a single moment, but as a choice between silence and memory, inevitability and defiance. The Necrons marched, the stars dimmed, the warp recoiled, and still humanity raised its voice. Not to conquer, not to survive, but to matter. For in the end, that was the heart of the species. Not that it refused to die, but that it refused to be forgotten. The tombs were open. The silence was here. The galaxy was ending, and humanity, fragile and finite, screamed into eternity, daring silence itself to remember its name.